theory about the transparency of consciousness experience is supported by the paradigm of the out-of-the-body experience or virtual reality experience. In support with your theory, there is the idea developed by Antti Revonsu that the human consciousness is a world simulation with a center. Revonsu makes use of the dream paradigm. In all this kind of experience, out-of-the-body experience, virtual reality and dream, both direct perceptual stimuli and the relationship between the active senses and the body are absent. Does it mean that these experiences aren't perceptual experience, and what kind of relation exists between consciousness experience and perception?
Mm-hmm. I have said that dreams are offline states, that sensory stimulation doesn't play any role, and also for out-of-body experience. But more recent research has shown that this is actually not true. There is something that has been called the full disembodiment hypothesis by Jennifer Wind. I strongly recommend her 2014 book with MIT Press on dreams. And it is actually not true if one looks that the dream body is fully disembodied. There are many ways that sensory stimuli actually enter the dream scene. One possibility experimentally is, for instance, that you can have cuffs, like for measuring blood pressure, in a sleep lab and slowly inflate them. And you create pressure on the physical arm, and something will happen in the dream with the dream body. So it is not true that the body representation in the dream state is completely offline. I think the story is much more complicated. Another thing that I think is very important is if you are in a lucid dream, there are these experiments that I think were scientifically very important by LaBerge, 1981, in Perceptual and Motor Skills. A lucid dreamer can, for instance, signal that he has become aware that he's dreaming by moving his eyeballs up and down. And then in the sleep lab, you see the physical eyes going up and down, and you know, he's talking to us. He's telling us, I am now lucid in a dream. This is another example of how the body model in the conscious dream state is grounded in the physical body. For most other movements, it's not the case. You can wave your arms in a dream and your body stays paralyzed. But there's a matching of gaze direction, how you look with your eyeballs in the dream states, to physical gaze direction. And that is an interesting thing. There may be a deeper thought, I guess, that vision is our most dominant perceptual modality, and there is a visual perspective. And if we change the visual perspective in the dream state, this goes right down into the physical basis of the body and something happens. It doesn't happen for arm movements or leg movements. So there is some point, and that is of course philosophically also very interesting, the question, what part of the conscious self-representation is directly grounded in the hardware through a computational process and then realization in the brain. And it seems shifting your visual perspective is one of the very few things where there is this grounding. But then there are many examples how perception can enter dream reality. Like if you just drip water on somebody in a sleep lab, something happens. I have been trying to sleep with these devices that are supposed to cause lucid dreams that give you soft red flashes that don't wake you up, but then you have red lights appearing in the dream narrative. So I think the first things I wrote in earlier publications, that the dream is a fully offline state and a pure virtual reality, is not true. Dreams are grounded in the physical body in many ways.
The concept of transparency is correlated with the concept of self-model, by the way that we don't recognize the model of self as a model. In the same way, we don't recognize the representation of the world as a model. This means that we deceive ourselves about the nature of the self as well as the inner representation of the world. In this sense, could virtual reality be an experience that generates a sort of awareness of this transparency?
I think one has to be very careful. First, I have looked at uses of the concept of transparency in academic research. There are 4 different uses. One in communication theory, a channel can be transparent. That's not what we mean. 3 in philosophy. Epistemic transparency in Descartes, for instance. I cannot be wrong about the contents of my own mind. This is not what we're talking about. Then there is referential semantic transparency in analytical philosophy, is also not what we're talking about. So what we mean is only phenomenal transparency as a property of phenomenal states, conscious states. Now, there are often misunderstandings. The first thing I think one has to be very clear about is it's only a property of conscious states. An unconscious representation in the brain is neither transparent nor opaque in this sense, only phenomenal states. The second thing I've pointed out, I think that is philosophically interesting, is not all phenomenal states are transparent. There are exceptions. I will give 3 examples for exceptions. If you have a simple pseudo-hallucination, say you have taken LSD again on a Sunday and you sit there and there is a breathing pattern on the wall, you realize that you are hallucinating. You realize that this is not real, which means this is a phenomenal representation of color, geometry, and so forth, a breathing pattern on the wall that is opaque. It's part of the experience, there is a representation, and it's probably a misrepresentation. Something's wrong with my eyes or my brain. Example number 2, lucid dreams. I think a normal dream is completely transparent. In normal dreams, the dreamer just thinks this is reality and I am awake. The dreamer does not know he or she is dreaming. But the moment the rare event happens that the dreamer becomes lucid, it's not an intellectual knowledge only that, this is a dream, I'm dreaming. The phenomenology changes, and maybe it is right to say that the dream reality, the model of reality in a dream state has become opaque, because suddenly you realize, wow, this is all a representation. It's a misrepresentation, and I am lying in bed right now, the physical body. But this is, for instance, also one thing I have written 10 years ago in the book Being No One. If one looks carefully, it is not true that even in a lucid dream, and a virtual reality experience might be something like a lucid dream, everything is opaque. If one carefully looks at it, for instance, if you are in a lucid dream and another dream character comes to you and talks to you, you do not have the experience, you're just a dream figure. You immediately take it seriously, even if it's a lucid dream. Another interesting thing is, of course, in normal lucid dream, yourself is real. I am having a lucid dream. So not everything is opaque. But the third thing I want to point out, and I think is philosophically very important, is if you look at the human self model, the conscious model of self, some parts are transparent, typically the body model. You never realize that this is a model. The body is real. phenomenologically. But the highest level, when I consciously think about philosophy and I start to try to understand Claudia's question, for instance, what is cognitive phenomenology? What is the specific phenomenology of thinking? I think it is the phenomenology of operating with representations that may be true or false. I have a representation of Claudia, I have a representation of what she's asking me, but I know this may not be reality, this may be false. So I think a very important part is that in the human self model there is one part that is not transparent. And it may be, for instance, that many animals, conscious animals on the planet, their self model is completely transparent. They just identify fully. And because they identify fully, they cannot create a distance to themselves. But human beings, for instance, in thinking about themselves, can take a simulated outside perspective. They realize that at least their thinking is a representation. And if one looks at it, this is also phenomenologically interesting. It's hard to describe. My body is real. But somehow my thoughts are not in the world, they are not so real. And I think there is a gradient of transparency in the human self model. And one of my ideas is that emotions are in the middle between cognition and body perception. And emotions are sometimes transparent and sometimes opaque. So if I am right that the transparency of the self model creates the identification, the experience of I am this, then it would be very interesting in the future to look at the distribution of this I am this. Sometimes you have a very strong feeling of being identical with this, but sometimes it can also be weaker. And I think it would be very good if philosophers and cognitive scientists investigated this more closely in the future.
You have studied the condition of the self during the out-of-the-body experience. In particular, you applied this kind of experience in laboratory with the use of virtual reality technology called head-mounted display. An interesting result of this experiment is that during the experience, the subject are active two self-models at the same time, but the model that operates is the out-of-the-body model instead the vivid body. How do you explain this co-presence of the two self-model and what does it mean?
So the first thing I have to explain is that what we have created in the classic 2007 experiments that was reported in Science was a full body illusion and not an out-of-body experience. The journalists worldwide have reported scientists have created an out-of-body experience in a lab. That was the original goal. That is also what I, as a philosopher who had written about out-of-body experiences, said to Olaf Blanke and Binja Lengenhager and Tej Tadi, to the scientists. We must make this a repeatable experience in the lab. The first thing one has to see, it's now 2013, 6 years later, there are no out-of-body experiences in the lab. Because an out-of-body experience would mean that you also see through the eyes of the avatar. But what happens if it works, and it's a weak effect, the rubber hand illusion is a stronger effect, but if it happens is that the sense of identification jumps into the avatar. But your visual perspective is still, so to speak, in the physical body. So you never fully go into the avatar, and also you don't move. So if one looks more closely, and as a young man, I've had some spontaneously occurring out-of-body experiences myself. I know both things. I know the virtual reality experience, and I know the spontaneously occurring out-of-body experiences. They are two completely different things. typically, not for me, but because I expected the room to be dark, during an out-of-body experience you will also see your body. You don't have that in virtual reality, that you are in a second body and see it from the outside. Typically there's also flying, you move around. It's not like that. The transition phase is different. So I think if one looks at it closely, there is a spectrum of very different experiences. There is autoscopy in neurological perspective, there's heautoscopy. The out-of-body experience an epileptic has may be something very different from the out-of-body experience, say, a monk has that meditates for a long time in a monastery. That may be a very different experience from, say, a drug user that has taken a large amount of cannabis and is wiped out, or has injected ketamines. Ketamine has been associated with out-of-body experiences, is in the illegal drug scene. These may all be different experiences and not the same thing. And something I've recently thought about a lot, what is also interesting is that there are asomatic out-of-body experiences, and there are also asomatic dreams. Some out-of-body experiences, there is not a second body, but you are just a point in space looking down. And in some dreams, people are also just a point in space, and they have no dream body. So, what is an out-of-body experience? One possibility, many possibilities are discussed. I think a good point is that it is a vestibulomotor hallucination. That is, you have a very strong vestibular sensation of tilting over and flying, which doesn't take place. So it is a hallucination that is not a visual hallucination, but a hallucination of the sense of balance. Then it is often a motor hallucination, even if you don't see anything. It's an experience of movement, sometimes of movement you do yourself, flying in the out-of-body experience. Then it has something to do with taking a perspective. If 56% of out-of-body experiences, not all of them, involve a visual perspective. Typically after an accident, people have an external visual perspective on their body. Some experiences are auditory, where people don't see anything, for instance in a dark bedroom at night, but they just hear the body breathing and they're outside. So one third aspect is, I guess, the mechanism of self-location in space. And one idea that could be, there are different things that allow you, your brain, to know where am I. One is the vestibular sense. One is bodily self-perception, and maybe sometimes they can fall apart. Normally it's all nicely integrated. My visual perspective originates in my head. My sense of balance perfectly matches my body perception. If you want, these are three frames of references in space. And maybe sometimes they just fall apart, and then you have the feeling I am drifting out of my body. But we don't know. And nobody has created out-of-body experiences in the lab.
The phantom limb illusion, as well as the whole body illusion, are similar diseases, show that how consciousness activates a holistic model of the self.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, there are other diseases in which the organic representation is disintegrated in favor of a partial representation of the model. For example, in paraplegic identity, you don't see your body as a whole, but you see your model not whole, not at all.
Okay.
In this case, what happens at the representational level within consciousness? What is the mental process that creates this condition?
Nobody knows. I don't know, but what we have learned, I guess, from the last 100 years of neuropsychology is that the human self model has many different layers. There is a layer of space representation. There is also a layer of time representation, the nowness, the presence in time of it. There is body representation, emotional representation, and all these deficits show us it's philosophically important if we know this can be specifically lost. Many philosophers make a mistake by thinking all these examples you mention are not relevant for a philosophical theory of self-consciousness, but they are relevant because if you show a functional dissociation, if you have A and B, and you can show that A can be lost and B is still there, and you show that B can be lost and A is still there, then you learn something about the architecture of self-consciousness. And if you see two things are always together and they can never be dissociated functionally, you also learn something about the functional architecture of human self-consciousness. And this is why all these lesion studies or altered states of consciousness and psychiatric syndromes are very important for philosophers, because they give us an idea about the modularity of the conscious self, about the functional architecture. That is how we learn something about self-consciousness. And I mean, who would have thought? Our experiments have shown that, but for instance, Derrida has also shown this with direct stimulation, that you can look out of your eyes and the sense of self, just this feeling of I am this and I am here, can be moved out of the head to the left and back into the head with 40 millivolts, with an electrode in the brain, and out of the head and into the head. And while you see out of the eyes all the time, this shows us that the origin of the visual perspective and the sense of this is me can be dissociated. And that's an information.
In recent years has developed a debate about the ability to human mind to mentalize the other state of mind. The research on intersubjectivity involves several areas of research, from social neuroscience to psychology, philosophy, neurotechnology, and so on. The central idea is that the self emerges from a succession of mental states we start on the encounter with the other. In the other words, the self is only given in the relationship with the other mind. Are you agree with this assumption, and what does it mean in the perspective of phenomenal self-model?
A basic approach I very much like is Vittorio Galese's theory of embodied simulation. So I think there is a basic form of intercorporality, of being together as bodies and automatically simulating each other through the mirror system in the premotor cortex. That's a very important building block, and I think that we all are resonating with each other through the unconscious layers of our motor self models, so that we swim in a sea of unconscious, pre-reflective intersubjectivity. But of course, there are many levels of description, and what I think would be important is to formulate the philosophical questions in a way that they can be treated by the empirical sciences, that we can formulate empirical hypotheses. Of course, I have grown up in the 70s of the last century. I have a strong conditioning. It is politically correct that subjectivity is in its core intersubjectivity. And everybody who thinks that subjectivity might be a biological phenomenon, when I was a philosophy student, we said that is proto-fascist, and biology was very suspect. But of course, an important possibility for a politically correct solution I see is that, for instance, the human infant, the baby, I think that's a logical possibility, might first discover that mama has mental states, might first discover that mama has properties you cannot perceive, you cannot see it, but you can manipulate the mama object. For instance, when you scream, you can do something to her and she comes and suddenly starts to attribute feelings, emotions, and thoughts to mama out there as the first step. And as soon as the baby has done that, then it discovers I have such states too. So that you first have mental meta-representation in the social domain, you first represent it outside before having mental meta-representation in the individual domain and discover, oh, I have feelings too and thoughts have too. This would, of course, be a politically correct solution because it shows that the human self is growing up in intersubjectivity from the beginning. But I think what we don't need is political correctness or philosophical speculation. The contribution philosophers can make is, I think, maybe ask questions so precisely that we can find out empirically what is really the case with the baby and the mother and what comes first. It's what I think is meaningless is to have phenomenological speculation about subjectivity and intersubjectivity and just dream something up. There are just two possibilities, or three possibilities. One possibility is we just cannot find this out, what the truth is, what the first sense of subjectivity is, neither by science nor by philosophy. The second possibility is only the neuroscientists and the developmental psychologists can find it out by themselves. And the third possibility is it is still possible that philosophers make a contribution in that process, in interdisciplinary cooperation.
A silly relation to intersubjectivity, the discovery of a mirror neuron system. In human mind has not resolved the problem about whether the ability to understand the other mind is innate or not innate characteristic of mind. In chapter 6 of the Ego Tunnel, you explain the meaning of empathic eye, ego, empathic eye, the empathic.
Oh, yeah.
And you argue that intersubjectivity takes roots in both biological and cultural development in humankind.
Yes.
Okay. Does this mean that the mentalization is innate ability of the mind?
I think I am not an expert, I must say, in biology, but I would say that the distinction between innate and acquired is an old conceptual distinction that we have passed by, because there is not only genetics but also epigenetics. And we may have some implicit genetic potentialities, but then it depends on your social culture environment as a baby, how, so to speak, the genetic information, your potential to empathize unfolds or doesn't unfold in certain windows. So I think the question, is it inborn or is it acquired, is not the right question. The question is rather, under what conditions does it unfold in the interaction with an environment? If that is true, I mean, that is just a footnote, but everybody is allowed to drive a car. Who wants to drive a car has to do a driver's license. But everybody who wants to have children can just have children. And I think we must take much more care about, so to speak, the epigenetic conditions in which children develop empathy in the first 3 years before school. That may be extremely critical for developing the emotional self-model in a child. And I think we should be something like the Swedish philosopher Katinka Evers has called it epigenetically proactive. We should maybe look much more into what is actually happening in the first 3 years and not let every idiot ruin their children. It's actually maybe a functional time window in which some things happen, and after that it's very difficult to learn certain kinds of empathy. And maybe, modern psychology, neuroscience teaches us that we have to take much more care how very young children are treated than we did in the past. Because we close windows and people do terrible things to children. So if that is true, culture, society even has a moral obligation to help newborns to epigenetically unfold their potential for empathy.
You are a partner in European project called VERE, and which aims at solving the boundary between the human and virtual body and between reality, physical reality and reality, through the use of sophisticated robotics devices and virtual reality systems. The central aspect of the project is to integrate both the neuroscience and engineering research in the field of neurocognitive rehabilitation. You are working within the project to discover the ethical issues, to confine the research in the limits of the ethical instance. What are these ethical parameters, and what is your research method inside the project?
Well, let me first be really honest with you. As a philosopher, I'm actually really interested in a theory of self-consciousness, and I think that the work done in the famous VERE project is very relevant to philosophical theories of self-consciousness, and philosophers will discover this fact maybe in 20 years. So that's why I'm there. But new knowledge also creates new technologies. That is, VERE will not only create insights in the mechanism in which virtual bodies are created and so forth, but historically new action potentials. And traditionally, there is a field in philosophy called applied ethics. It needs professional ethicists to look at the development and not only as a conceptual police, but also as an ethical police, to see if there are dangerous developments. If any of this works, it may change our life world in unprecedented ways. Virtual reality technology, right now it is only virtual reality research. But if it is successful, there will be virtual reality technologies of different kinds. And it is important to assess the consequences, also the cultural and social consequences of embedding new technologies into the way we live with each other. I'll give you some examples. There will obviously be military applications of virtual reality technology. Who should have access to these applications? Should we maybe keep something secret? Another thing is, there may be new ways for consumer manipulation. If everybody in the internet talks to avatars that really speak natural language, there will be new ways of manipulating consumer behavior. Another possibility is entertainment technologies. We have 560,000 people in Germany are diagnosed as internet addicted right now. In South Korea, there's a large number of children that satisfy the definition criteria for internet addiction. If this works, and I'm not sure if it works, we have to wait some years, but if it works, it may be that there will be a revolution in gaming and also in filmmaking that is so overwhelmingly attractive that more people become just addicted to these medial environments because they are so cool and so new. We see many people, myself included, we all have a problem with our iPhones right now, but maybe things get really good. And how will we deal with this? Another problem is we don't know what the psychological long-term consequences are. maybe if you identify with an avatar for a longer time and it works, and you phenomenologically return to the biological body, this does something to your self-model. So there are many detailed issues, and let me just explain the principle. I think one good metaphorical way to look at consciousness is as a virtual reality. Mother Nature has generated a virtual reality. There are no colored objects out there. Colored objects are something in the conscious model of reality, and so on. Maybe there's no self. The self is a model in the virtual reality. And now we create technological virtual reality and technological surrogate selves, avatars, robots, and we couple, so to speak, bio-cyberspace to techno-cyberspace. Nobody knows what this will do to us, and our brains have not evolved for this environment. They also have no chance to adapt to it. So we create completely new medial environment. Maybe they make us happy, maybe they make us smarter, but maybe there are also psychological risks.
Another ethic question. You often talk about the revolution of consciousness, and you explain it as a phenomenon that has a double ethical effects. The knowledge about the underlying mechanism of the consciousness implies, on one hand, the possibility to humans to have a better autonomy and to control over themselves, and on the other hand, there is a possible that it will be a dangerous risks for the humankind. And what these risks consist exactly?
Well, I think one thing we can see very clearly. In the early 60s, we had, with the invention of LSD, so topic number one is drugs. We had the first semi-synthetic molecule that was not toxic, not addictive, and was taken by millions of people in the world and had dramatic mind-altering properties. And we have not come to a creative solution how to integrate this into our society. The only thing we've managed in America and Europe is to forbid it, push it underground, and keep it illegal. So then we've had a time where we only had 12 to 15 illegal molecules. And now, as I've said in the Ego Tunnel, was published 2009, I said this situation with molecules, pharmacological stimuli that alter consciousness may dramatically change through science. And I have been right in the 3 years after the Ego Tunnel was published. I think it was in 2010, it was 42 new molecules. In 2011, it was 49 molecules. Last year, the European community has found 73 new illegal drugs that have never been confiscated on the market before. So the been broken 3 times in a row. There is an illegal industry that reads scientific research about neuropharmacology. That is an example of what happens if for 50 years you repress the facts and you do not develop a culture of dealing with new ways of changing consciousness. If you just look the other side, it's okay for 50 years, and then the technological consequences just come and overwhelm you. So now we have a situation where Chinese mafia produces new synthetic cannabinoids or cathinones and imports them for the rich children in Europe, and there's no end in sight. This is a result because we haven't discussed this. We have had the stupid war on drugs started by the Americans. That war is lost, and we have not thought about an intelligent cultural integration. Now the situation is basically unsolvable. We're going to have many illegal drugs, And young people are going to come in emergency stations on molecules that the doctors haven't even heard the name when they studied medicine. That's the situation. Now, that was one example. There are also legal things, cognitive enhancement. Then we've already discussed medial environments will get better and better and better. But I mean, the facts are not clear, but I think there is acquired attention deficit disorder. The lectures I could give to the students in my university 5 years ago, exactly the same PowerPoint lectures, I cannot finish a single one of them now anymore because they're just gaga, they don't read books anymore, 1/3 of them is online. They have difficulty with old-fashioned texts, and in a discipline like philosophy, it's a problem if you don't know how to read books. You just have to read boring books without pictures and videos. So I think we already see psychological changes that we don't understand properly. Many people are burnt out, exhausted, nervous. Myself too, have neurotic patterns of interacting with the internet. Book reading, writing culture is going away. There are many empirical indicators. Some years ago, for instance, it would be normal that a child buys its own book from its own money because it's interested at 12 or 13. Now, many young people buy their first own book at 18. And this has consequences which are very difficult to foresee. And so it's a mesh, many things happen at the same time. You see drone warfare, you see modern cognitive enhancers like modafinil used in the Iraq war. So you see that some of these technologies are already used in military conflicts. These are just some examples. I think the problem is to think ahead what we want to do with this technological problem so that we don't have a reactive attitude that something happens and then we have to do something. It's too late. And basically, I mean, laws don't help. Forbidding things doesn't help. For instance, research on drugs and alcohol has shown, scientific research, if you want to control consumer behavior, the most efficient way to control it is not laws and police, but a cultural context. If a society creates a cultural context, you don't do this, you only do that, and so forth. That works. So it's not a question of new laws, but it is a question that all of us together create a new cultural context in which these technologies can be embedded. So basically, I think there's a scientific evolution, there's a technological evolution, and if there's no cultural evolution, we're just going to be washed away.
Last question. A question about research methodology.
Mm-hmm.
You are carrying out a philosophical research which measures itself with neuroscience, with digital technology, psychology, and so on. Do you believe that philosophy should act as a gatekeeper that monitors the work of other science, or rather should it forge ahead in the direction of the discovery of a common research plane in which the other science at the same level pursue the same goals?
That is a very good question, a very interesting question. So I think some areas of philosophy, I come out of an area that's called analytical philosophy of mind, must today operate with a strong level of interdisciplinarity. That does not mean that all areas of philosophy have to do this. For instance, I think there are large areas in logic, for instance, that can be just armchair philosopher work or formal semantics maybe. History of philosophy maybe doesn't need so much interdisciplinary interaction. What we don't have is a model of how that should work. Different people have different opinion what interdisciplinarity should be. I think one role of philosophers should be to be the conceptual police. So neuroscientists talk a lot of nonsense, and there are simple things, logical mistakes philosophers can point out. The standard example is the mereological fallacy and the homunculus fallacy. So neuroscientists attribute personal level predicates to brain parts and say these neurons see that and that part of the brain detects those edges, and I don't know, you know, this part of premotor cortex forms an intention. And it's important for philosophers to have a job of conceptual clarification. A second, I think, job philosophers that's pretty uncontroversial is to create a meta-theoretical commentary, that is to be empirically informed and see what the scientists find out, and then ask more general questions like, what does this mean for our concept of consciousness? How does this change our concept of an emotion? How does this change our concept of will, or something like that? So just a conceptual commentary changing and empirically enriching and differentiating concepts. But what I also think philosophers should do more in the future is to not passively, like embedded journalists that are informed, go along with the neurosciences, but also actively intervene. One example we've had is ethics. We need an ethically, critically, and also politically critical philosophy looking at what is happening. Neuroscientists are not holy men. They are driven by career interests, by funding interests. They are not philosophical saints, just as philosophers are not philosophical saints who just want knowledge. Modern science is a very competitive process, and there's a lot of noise on the signal. So there's a critical function of philosophers there, but I think philosophers should, if they interact with scientists, also actively propose epistemic goals. Like a philosopher might well say, do this, try that. Don't only do this. From my discipline, from the perspective of my discipline, it would be more relevant if you do that. Why don't you do that? So this interdisciplinary cooperation is running. At least in my country, in Germany, I do this for roughly 30 years now. I was the first person to do this. I got a lot of resistance, a lot of friction resistance in my career, hatred. 5 years younger than me, there are already 4 people who do that. And now, your age, young German philosophers of cognitive science and mind, it's like a movement, a people's movement. They all have one speciality, like social cognition or emotion or color vision or artificial intelligence, and are empirically well informed. And everybody of them has their own ideas about what good interdisciplinarity is and try their own thing. It's a wild and very active and productive social movement. The big problem I see, I don't know about Italy, but in Germany, the academic system is very rigid with career paths. It's okay to do a PhD. It's maybe okay to be a postdoc. But then a large part of the resources, the positions, are occupied by people who just do history of philosophy or just do pure analytical armchair philosophy. And the question is if this new generation of philosophers, if they can stay in their country and see positions there, or if they all have to go to other countries. Most of the people who studied with me, they get professorships in Japan, in Canada, or in Taiwan. And in Germany, we do Kant and Husserl, and maybe we will do Kant and Husserl in 200 years. So it is also a political problem, interdisciplinarity. Can the academic system adapt to the necessary changes? So I think, to sum it up, philosophers should not only be passive, empirically informed, critical observers, they should actively intervene in the process and maybe sometimes even design an experiment themselves or ask somebody, I would like to do this experiment. Would that work? How can we do it?